Evening all. Well, I'm pretty excited because this coming November, there's going to be a film out in the cinema called Ford v Ferrari. It stars Christian Bale and MATTDAMON, and it's about the Ford's quest to develop a racing car that is good enough to beat Ferrari at the 24-hour Le Mans. It's a story about how they developed the Ford GT40. And I'm really looking forward to it because I've seen the trailer. The trailer looks great. And I think it's a fascinating story because I've seen a documentary on the subject. I've read a book as well about this battle between Ford and Ferrari in the mid-1960s. The whole story about how Henry Ford II wanted to turn Ford's fortunes around because in 1959 they were really lagging in the car market. They'd released the Edsel, which was a hugely unpopular car, and their fortunes were on the wane. And Henry Ford II decided in the early 60s that he was going to turn the company around, make it a global brand. And what he needed was to develop two cars in particular. One was an affordable sports car that people the world over who had a little bit of money could afford, and that became the Ford Mustang. And the other one was the GT40, which was going to be the racing car, and it could also be a road car as well. But its job was to take on the major motor racing teams like Ferrari and win at the most important prestigious races. So really looking forward to it. Christian Bale plays the British racing driver Ken Miles, and MATTDAMON plays the racer and car developer Carol Shelby. So really looking forward to that. And I thought I would take this opportunity to do a Millennials guide to motor racing films. So there are lots of car racing films, and also films that touch on motor racing, not specifically about motor racing. There's quite a lot, so I'm not going to mention all of them. Some of the ones which I think are too tangential, like the Mad Max films, I'm not going to be talking about, but I'll give you my personal recommendations for which I think are the must-see motor racing films and which ones you should avoid, and a few other interesting ones that play around with the subject and the genre. Now, you would think for a sport that is about speed, fast cars, excitement, sporting competition, that there'd be loads of really good motor racing films. Unfortunately, there aren't. There are more bad ones than there are good ones, which is a shame. And it seems that the genre is almost as old as the sport itself. So, like I said, I will mention my top picks, and I'll mention some of the ones that I think you should avoid, unless you want to do one of those bad film challenges. And I'm going to mention a few other honourable mentions as well. So let's crack on with my top picks. Of the top picks, probably the best one all round is Grand Prix. Made in 1966, directed by John Frankenheimer, and starring James Garner, Yves Montand, and an international cast. Now, this one really is, it ticks all the boxes. Frankenheimer is my all-time favourite film director, and he liked things to be authentic. You know, in his best films, he tried to go for authenticity, and not just with the script and what goes in it, but how the effects would be done. So he famously didn't like models being used to replicate real things. In later life, he didn't use CGI. Everything had to be done in camera using practical special effects, full size. So in a film like The Train, which he did in 1965, he was actually crashing real trains into each other, blowing up real road depots. And in Grand Prix, he doesn't use models again. He wanted to go for authenticity, so we have real racing cars, and he and his team developed camera mounts to put on racing cars, so you could get the camera, that shot where the camera is pretty much above a wheel, on the wheel arch, and or on the rear of the car, and they could go up to full racing speed in the film, and it really looks authentic. That's why I think Grand Prix is the best motor racing film. The racing sequences are absolutely stunning, spectacular, superbly well filmed, and it gives you a flavour for the motor racing at the time. This is 1966, so you've got that classic Prix. It's Prix sponsorship on the cars, so the cars look slick and graceful, and it's also a time which was very dangerous in the sport. It was a time when drivers died frequently. I don't think a season went past in those days where a driver or two was killed. So you got the threat of death, and as a viewer, you're sitting watching these cars going at full racing speed with camera mounted on the cars. And also, James Garner himself was an amateur racing driver. He did club racing on weekends in California. So he was able to sit in the car and do his own driving in some sequences. And this is good because they put the camera on the car facing Garner and film him going around the circuits at racing speed. And, you know, it's James Garner. Likewise, they did it with the other actors as well, like Yves Montand and the other two main protagonist drivers. But apparently, they weren't committed racers, and they didn't like being filmed trying to get these Formula One cars to go drive around these classic circuits at 150 or so miles an hour. So some of their shots, it's a little bit sparing, the kind of reaction shots in there in the car, but still you're getting Yves Montand at Monza going at 150 miles an hour. You see it's Yves Montand. So it's a very authentic film. They used the real racing teams of the era, Ferrari, BRM, and real drivers have cameos, either as themselves or I think you've got Graham Hill and Phil Hill playing fictional drivers, but you know they get a few lines of dialogue here. So they're mixing in the actors with the real racing drivers again for that authenticity. It also has a lot of melodrama in it. It comes across as a bit soap opera like, so you might think that's a detraction. It also has Eva Marie Saint, Françoise Hardy, and a young Jessica Waters, way before she was doing Arrested Development, when she was in her mid-20s and quite hot. And you know, you get the romance and the relationships going on between the racing drivers and the women in their lives. And again, you can see that it's kind of soap opera, but it does give you a story to follow throughout the whole of this motor racing season, because it covers a world championship season in Formula One. And I think it is the best all-round motor racing film you can watch, so that's my top recommendation. My other top pick is the 1970 Steve McQueen movie Le Mans. This is very different in tone to Grand Prix, whereas Grand Prix has a kind of soap opera story to go along with the racing action. Le Mans doesn't really have a story at all. Steve McQueen plays a racing driver who's struggling to come to terms with being back at a race in which the previous year he was involved in a bad accident which resulted in the death of another driver. So he's sort of getting back from that, and there's question marks over whether he can cut it, whether he's too dangerous a driver. But I'm picking up a story that is very thin on the ground. These things are kind of hinted at rather than explicitly stated. Adding to the complications, the fact that the dead driver's widow, is at this race as well, and she's now dating another racing driver. So there's lots of kind of potentially interesting plot threads which are not picked up on. Also, Steve McQueen's character has a rivalry with... Steve McQueen drives a Porsche, and his rival, a German driver, drives for Ferrari, and they're renowned as two ultra-competitive men who do not give each other an inch and fight wheel to wheel, although they have a very cordial, friendly relationship. So they're not they don't dislike each other as people. They like each other as people, but they have this intense rivalry on the track. As I said, I'm bigging up the story here. There's really not much. It's a film you experience through its visuals. Again, no model work, no CGI. This is 1970. So you're getting real racing action. And what they did, the producers, is that they entered a car into the 1970 Le Mans race, and it had a camera on the front and back, and this racing car could travel at close to racing speeds. It was weighed down a bit by the cameras, but it could film footage of the race itself, and then that would be intercut in with race scenes that they were filming and staging. So they had the Le Mans circuit immediately after the race was run, and they got to recreate scenes and then mix it in with the footage that they had taken at trackside during the actual event. So it's very authentic as a race film. It looks fantastic. The cinematography is fantastic. The real stars of the film, not so much Steve McQueen, who did all his own driving in this film. And he was one of these actors who was a talented amateur racer. The previous year, in 1969, he came second at the 12 Hours Sebring race, driving a Porsche 908. So he had racing chops, and the stunt driving in Le Mans is done by real racing drivers. So Steve McQueen is wheel to wheel, driving at the same speeds as the professional drivers and sort of overtaking and weaving, and he does it extremely well. So kudos to Steve McQueen. But the real star are the cars, mainly the Porsche 917, which for me is my all-time favorite racing car. It's a beautiful looking car. Go and look it up, the Porsche 917, and I think it was the most powerful and fastest racing car ever designed. It was so powerful that the French authorities running Le Mans just said you can't run that car, and in 1972 they just banned the Porsche 917 and the Ferrari 512, which could almost match 917 for speed. So the Porsche 917s and the Ferrari 512s look absolutely gorgeous. There's some fantastic racing action. There's 2 excellent crash sequences there. And the last, I'd say 10 minutes of the film are genuinely nail-biting. Not a word of dialogue spoken. It's pure racing action, but it's wheel-to-wheel, really intense. So if you're looking for conventional entertainment, you're going to be disappointed by Le Mans. If you want a kind of more immersive film where you feel like you're half at the trackside watching a race happening and half being in the car with the drivers, then if you approach the film on that ground, you won't be disappointed. Moving on, my third recommendation for good motor racing films is 2013's Rush. The story of Niki Lauda and James Hunt, their rivalry and their friendship in Formula One in the 1970s. Niki Lauda is played superbly by Daniel Bruhl, who has all his voice, the mannerisms, the attitude. He nails Niki Lauda absolutely. He's perfect in the role. Chris Hemsworth plays James Hunt. He's almost a good fit for Hunt. I think he does a lot of things well. He brings across a lot of Hunt's charisma, and he gets the voice almost right. He kind of looks like James Hunt. There were a few other actors I think could have played James Hunt. So he comes across pretty well. He's not quite the perfect fit that Daniel Bruhl is for Niki Lauda, but he does James Hunt well enough. The film itself exaggerates their rivalry because in real life they were very good friends. But the 1976 season, which is what the film centers around, did put their friendship under strain. They were sort of intense rivals at that time. They remained good friends up until Hunt's death. And The film recreates the 70s races in the 1976 Formula One season superbly. You know, they've got all the classic old cars, race them. It evokes the atmosphere and the style without being that kind of you know, greatest hits of the 60s 70s soundtrack albums. It doesn't rely too much on that. And it captures the drama of the '76 season very well. I'd say it's about 80% accurate. I think what it hypes up is the needling rivalry between Hunt and Lauder. It doesn't show enough of their genuine friendship, but that aside, what they do for the film to capture it and to put the viewer into the experience, I think is great. It's the film you'd watch if you're not a motor racing fan. I'd say Rush is the one, because you're following the characters and you will learn stuff through the sport and hopefully appreciate it a bit more by watching it. So that's the triumvirate: Grand Prix, Le Mans, Rush. Let's talk a little bit about the stinkers, and there are quite a few. I think the stinkiest motor racing film is probably Driven. This is the Sylvester Stallone film, which is either about IndyCar racing or Formula One. It's not quite sure. It's just so ludicrous and absurd and over-reliant on CGI, unconvincing, implausible, badly performed all round. It's an insult to motor racing fans, really. So that's one really to avoid. Just departs from realism, no end. So give that one a miss. Likewise, Days of Thunder, Tom Cruise film, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. I think this is the one where they met and fell in love in real life. This is about NASCAR, that American stock car racing, going around in ovals that they particularly like over there. And it's trying to do for motor racing what Top Gun did for jet fighters. And it doesn't come anywhere as close, you know. And I'm not a fan of Top Gun, but Days of Thunder is even worse. Is it because Tom Cruise finds a new level of being insufferable? There you go. I think the best way to describe the plot of the film is to borrow from Rich Hall's comedy sketch, where every Tom Cruise film is exactly the same. So Tom Cruise is a racing driver. He's a pretty good racing driver until he has a crisis of confidence and he can't be a good racing driver anymore. Then he meets a beautiful woman and she helps convince him to become a good racing driver again. That's basically it. Nicole Kidman plays a neurosurgeon. And it's kind of the last hurrah for the Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer era of films. Don Simpson himself tried to get buff and had plastic surgery to make himself look more Chad. And he was meant to be a major character, play a major character in Days of Thunder, and he was so awful as an actor that they just cut his bit down to he's got a couple of lines, and he makes a couple of appearances, and that's it. And then he died shortly after from excess of the booze and the drugs and the women. So yes, don't watch Days of Thunder. Another stinker in a 1970s film called Bobby Deerfield, starring Al Pacino. Now, this is Al Pacino before he started shouting. So you're getting kind of more Al Pacino as he was in Serpico and The Godfather. So this is the problem with Bobby Deerfield. It's such a dull film, right? If you think Formula One and motor racing is dull sport to watch, Bobby Deerfield's not going to dispel that illusion. If you think Formula One and motor racing is an exciting sport to watch, you'll wonder what you're watching on Bobby Deerfield, because the racing sequences aren't that dramatic or exciting. It's Al Pacino's least charismatic and involving role that he's ever done. It just meanders, so long and introspective and kind of navel gazing, and people just gazing out into space in general. So much potential, because they filmed it around real Formula One circuits, and it would have been great to see those 70s Formula One teams being represented. And it's such a missed opportunity. Now I'm going to mention a few films where motor racing is important to the film, but it's not the focal point of the film. And one of these is the 1969 film Winning, starring Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. So Paul Newman's a racing driver on the American scene, so he's doing IndyCar, NASCAR, some sports car racing in it. But the film's more about his relationship to his family, his wife and children, trying to keep his family life under control. They've got a teenage son played by Richard Thomas, who was John Boy Walton in the Waltons. So yeah, that's more of kind of family drama that has motor racing in it. It's a decent film. Then there's a 1970s film called The Last American Hero with Jeff Bridges, which again is about the NASCAR. And that's a good all-round film. It kind of has that good old boy, Deep South vibe to it, you know, which I think in part inspired, was it Dukes of Hazzard? And so Jeff Bridges is very charismatic as a young, brash racing driver. It's so much better than Days of Thunder. And I think that's what it's worth checking out. You know, it's a good time capsule for racing of that era, and yeah, so I would recommend that one as a good watch. There's a 1955 film called The Racers with Kirk Douglas and Lee J. Cobb, which has got some good racing sequences in it, and it's good to see the cars of that era, the big front engine racing cars like the Alfa Romeos, the Ferraris, the Porsches. So it's looking a bit at Formula One and also sports car racing of that era. I think the drawbacks is the dialogue in the film is awful at times, quite melodramatic, but also it's got some good real racing sequences, the way they've recreated real races, say at Monte Carlo, Nürburgring, things like that. And it's good to see the cars going flat out in those sequences. But there's a lot of back projection. There's a lot of Kirk Douglas and or the other actors kind of wobbling their car around with this back projection behind them. It looks really fake. I think they should have done more trackside location filming and a lot less back projection. Grand Prix would do that 10 years after, you know, and not using technology that was beyond 1955. It's just, yeah, the back projection ruins it a little bit. There's a 1966 French film we're checking out called Un homme et une femme, directed by Claude Lelouch, starring Jean-Louis Trintignant and Anouk Aimée. And they're fantastic. They're charismatic. So the story is about a widow and a widower, and they both have children. And they meet and they fall in love and have a relationship. But he's a racing driver. And that puts their relationship a bit under strain because this is an era where racing drivers could quite easily be killed. So there's a lot of good racing scenes in there, woven in with the love story. Claude Lelouch himself is a bit of a petrolhead, doing the ultimate petrolhead short film called C'était un rendezvous. Look it up on YouTube. It's absolutely fantastic. It's just he clamps a camera to the front of his Mercedes sports car and goes hurtling through Paris at 4 o'clock in the morning, barely lifting his foot off the accelerator. So it's, yeah, check it out. It's absolutely mesmerising. But Un homme et une femme, man and woman, it's famous for its theme tune and its soundtrack. And I think it's a nice one. It's one that, you know, you could have your wife or girlfriend there. So I'm a bit sophisticated. Let's watch this French romantic film, but it's got car racing in. Talk a little bit about the weird ones now. So starting off with Death Race 2000. So this isn't so much a motor racing film as it is a dystopian science fiction film about a race that goes across America, and the object is not just to win, be the first across the finishing line. You get points for the people you run over. It's quite dark humour, John Carpenter film from 1975, and it's one of those cult films. I can't say it's a good film, but it's a cult film that people find enjoyable. In terms of children's films, there is Disney's done a lot of motor racing films. There's the Herbie, the Love Bug films. So this is the sentient Volkswagen Beetle, owned by Dean Jones, and They get into many escapades over a series of films. The most motor racing oriented one is Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo, where Herbie drives in the Monte Carlo Rally, and it's the only time you'll ever see a Porsche 917 going up against a Volkswagen Beetle in a motor race. It's utterly bizarre. As well as that, you've got the two Cars films. So this is a world of sentient cars, and it captures NASCAR pretty well. It's good racing sequences, even though it's animated. And the plot, though, is the Michael J. Fox film Doc Hollywood, just with cars. Okay, it was followed up by Cars 2, which has the plot of Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo with a little bit of Austin Powers dropped into it. It doesn't kind of hold together as a whole, but, the kids love it. Finally, in my kind of honourable mentions list are 3 films set round about the Edwardian times. There's the opening title sequence, the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, which captures the kind of turn of the century motor racing really well. Very well filmed, very well staged. Yeah, check that out. You get the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang film anyway, which is well worth it. You're millennials, you've probably just heard the name Chitty Chitty Bang Bang in passing. Do watch it. It's a great fun film, but it has that great opening title sequence involving motor racing at the turn of the century. Then you've got 2 films that are quite similar in tone. So one is Monte Carlo or Bust, which is trying to do for motor racing what those magnificent men in their flying machines did for flying in the Edwardian times. So it's the Monte Carlo Rally. I think it's set in the 1920s, actually, because Susan Hampshire plays a flapper. And it's got an all-star international cast headed by Tony Curtis, who seems to get involved in a lot of these kind of films. And it's a knockabout romp farce with all the money thrown up on screen, as they did back in the 1960s in comedy films. Just throw all the money up on the screen, see what you're paying for. And then the other one that's quite similar is a 1965 film called The Great Race, again with Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. It's this kind of bizarre motor racing film where they're trying to do a round-the-world car race. The race is kind of incidental. It gets dealt with very early on in the film, and it really is a series of set-piece comedy routines. And the film's quite long. It goes on for about 3 hours. It's a 3-hour-long comedy film, just a number of set pieces. It's in the Guinness Book of Records. It has the largest custard pie fight in film history. Let's talk a little bit about movies involving illegal street racing. Starting off, there was a 1970s film called The Gumball Rally with Michael Sarrazin, which is kind of coast-to-coast American race, all illegal, and they've got to avoid the cops and the authorities as well as trying to win the race. Okay, the plot sound familiar? Well, the plot was then used for the Cannonball Run series of films with Burt Reynolds, slightly bigger budget, bigger celebrity cast, played more broadly for laughs, terrifically popular when they were released. This is kind of Burt Reynolds at the zenith of his kind of wisecracking, stunt-filled comedy films. I think they've dated a bit, but still, get the popcorn and the beers, watch Cannonball Run films. And then I have to mention the Fast and the Furious films, which I don't particularly like. But they're hugely popular, 7 movies in total. And it doesn't look like they're going to slow down anytime soon. Pardon the pun. Ludicrous dialogue. It's not how you stands by your car. It's how you drives your car. And the racing sequences are bizarre. A lot of CGI. They've got this thing where when the drivers are inside the car, I think the filmmakers were on amphetamines and coke for the whole time, because when they're inside the car, it looks like the Stargate sequence from 2001, just all these lights flashing and vibrating, and then when they cut to the cars racing down the street, it's like, and then back inside the car. So I mean, if your tastes are kind of more for the brain dead popcorn spoon fed movie, and if you're a typical millennial, this will be right up your street. Pardon the pun again. So, there you go. That's my recommendations for top motor racing films. I can't wait for November. Ford v Ferrari, Christian Bale, and Matt Damon.